This is my Jeep. Bought it brand new 17 years ago. I was 24 years old. It's been a dream to drive, extremely reliable. Haven't touched anything under the hood in its entire time except for a water pump. But that's about to change. This should be a pretty fun video to shoot because we're going to tear down the top end of this old Jeep 4-liter and replace everything with brand new factory components with one exception. We're going to replace the factory stamped steel rockers with Harlan Sharp roller rockers. Now in order to access the lifters, we're going to have to pull the head. In order to pull the head, you need to move a lot of other things as well. So pulling the head requires removing, of course, the air intake and air box, both intake and exhaust manifold. You need to pull the radiator and fan shroud assembly and the grille in order to get to the camshaft. We're also going to remove the alternator and the power steering pump. Now before we can start taking anything apart, we need to drain the coolant out of the radiator. We'll save that. While that coolant drains, I'm also going to pull off my engine oil pan skid plate and drain my engine oil. Oh, hi, little dog. The reason we can't reuse this oil is that when we replace the camshaft and the lifters, we need to use a special break-in oil. All right, we have the coolant drained and the oil drained, so time to take out the oil filter. And somebody, me, put it on a little too tight last time, so we're gonna have to use an oil filter wrench. Let's close the petcock valve for the radiator, because that's essentially empty. So before we start tearing things apart under the hood, I do need to pull my winch off, because in order to replace the camshaft, I need front access. So we're going to take the winch, the grille, the radiator, and the condenser off. You also want to have your condenser, your entire air conditioning system evacuated at a dealership or a service facility, because you don't want to just vent that into the atmosphere. Now we'll disconnect the winch cables off of the battery, but also the battery cable, negative first, off of the battery. Anything you take off, you're going to want to label. So this will be winch, cable, negative, to battery. Pull the cables out. A little heavy. Time to take off the air intake. Just use a flathead screwdriver to loosen the connection to the throttle body right here. Then you need to remove the sensor. Squeeze and pull. Just pull that apart. Like that. And we'll pull this off the throttle body. Out it goes. Next, using an 8mm socket, remove the 3 bolts that secure the bottom of the air box to the driver's side front fender. In case any of you guys were wondering who that devilishly handsome man was in the background of my last shot, that would be my friend Jay. You'll recognize him from many a Moab adventure. Hello. Next up, we're going to remove the serpentine belts and then the alternator. To remove the serpentine belt, just want to insert a 1/2-inch drive ratchet or breaker bar into the tensioner, and then twist it clockwise, which removes tension, and then just pull the belts off the alternator and all the other pulleys. Next, we'll remove the 4 bolts attaching the alternator bracket to both the head on top and the block on the bottom. Might be easier to take the alternator itself off first. Using a 1/2-inch socket, remove the cable from the terminal on the alternator. And put the nut back on so we don't lose it. Using a 15mm socket on a breaker bar, we're going to remove the 2 bolts holding the alternator to the alternator bracket. Now, before actually removing the alternator, there's a little harness in the back, so just squeeze that and pull, remove that. Now insert a pry bar over the top of the alternator and then gently pry it off of its bracket. Just like that. Now before we undo the 4 bolts securing the alternator bracket to the block in the head, I want to very carefully unclip this wiring harness here. There we go. Now you can see the 2 upper bolts on the alternator bracket, and there's 2 more down below. These 4 bolts are removed with a 9/16 inch socket. Definitely going to need a breaker bar on those. After removing the alternator attachment bracket, let's come over across the engine bay to the coolant overflow reservoir. There's a little button on the back. Push that and slide straight up. And then to remove it completely, you need to remove this clip that attaches the hose to the bottle. With the clamp off, you might need to use a little awl and kind of carefully get it underneath the tube to separate it from the bottle. There we go. Next, we'll remove the power steering pump via 3 bolts that you access through holes in the pulley that runs it. Those 3 bolts are removed with a 1/2 inch deep well socket. Now we're going to remove the 4 bolts that attach the radiator shroud to the radiator, and we'll pull it back towards the front of the motor. There's the lower one. Really a screw, actually. Get a screw into the radiator bracket. On the driver's side of the vehicle, there's the 3rd and 4th screws that attach the radiator shroud to the radiator frame. Now it isn't necessary for this job, but I'm going to go ahead and remove the washer fluid reservoir. That'll be easier for me to show you where the 3 bolts are on each side of the radiator that we need to remove. After removing the fan shroud from the radiator and sliding it back towards the motor, we use a set of channel lock pliers to loosen the hose clamps on the radiator hoses, both upper and lower, and then we'll slide those off the radiator. It might leak just a little bit. Yep. Let's get the bucket. Or a lot. Now that we have both radiator hoses off the radiator, we can unbolt it. 3 bolts on each side. The 6 radiator bolts are 10mm. There we go. That should stay together. That's the last one. And just lift straight up. Nothing to it. With the radiator out of the way, there's now plenty of room to pull the fan shroud out. We'll put that in our pile of parts. Mine's broken, but it still works. With the radiator out, we're starting to get some room to work now. Alright guys, today is the third day I'm working on this project, but I think today we're going to try and get off the intake and exhaust manifolds, as well as the spark plug rail and the condenser. Let's start with the spark plug rail because that's pretty easy. It's removed with 4 half-inch bolts, and we'll just set it to the side as best we can. We'll get it over the dipstick there so it's well out of the way. Let's come around to the front of the motor and remove some of these hoses out of the way. I need a screwdriver on that one. There's one. There we go. Alright, move that out of the way. Now let's remove the throttle control cable by gently prying it off of the throttle body valve. Then remove it from this bracket, attaching it to the intake manifold by squeezing this clip with some pliers and pulling it straight through. Then unclip it here and then over there. And it's free. Using a flathead screwdriver, let's remove the tube that connects the intake manifold to the valve cover. Right behind that is another hose that connects the manifold to the brake booster. Pull on that to remove it. This tube that we just removed from the intake manifold that goes to the valve cover, don't try and pull the valve off the top of the valve cover. You'll almost certainly break it, but I just want to twist this hose until it comes out, like that. Do the same with the hose on the front of the valve cover, just twist it. Don't try to remove that valve. There we go. Next, in order to access the intake manifold, let's start removing all the sensors around the periphery. Start up front there. Several of these sensors, including this throttle position sensor, I just don't trust the old brittle plastic, so I'm just going to unscrew them. This one uses a T20 Torx. And that way you just gently pull this piece of rubber off of the metal nipple on the throttle body. On the far driver's side of the intake manifold are a couple of vacuum elbows. There's one here, another line here. You need to remove those. There's one. And this little guy here comes right off. With the various sensors removed from that electrical rail, use a 10mm socket and remove the rail itself. There are 2 bolts. Now let's remove the 2 10mm bolts securing this throttle body cable bracket to the intake manifold. Now we'll remove each of the 6 fuel injector clips. To do that, you need to pry up gently on this red tab. That's a release. And then right here, squeeze while pulling straight up. The last sensor that's attached to this rail here is a coolant temperature sensor. So we'll just squeeze that and remove it. Like that. We need to pull this fuel rail, but if you look there, you can see that the throttle body is most likely going to be in the way. The throttle body is removed from the intake manifold with 4 10mm bolts. Just make sure you have a new throttle body gasket for when we reinstall it upon reassembly. For that back bolt, you're going to need a deep well 10mm socket. Now that we have access to the fuel rail, we need to depressurize it and then remove it. I haven't done one of these before, but it appears that this is a clip that opens by swinging those jaws counterclockwise, and you should just be able to pull that fitting off or perhaps press it off with a tool. So that comes back. What I'm going to try is using a crescent wrench behind it, and then I'll just pry on the back of that crescent wrench to pop it loose. See how that works. There we go. And there's the fuel. Just need to deflect this line a little bit to finish getting it off. There we go. And it's free. Now let's go ahead and take off the 4 10mm bolts that secure the fuel rail to the intake manifold. Now for the notoriously fun part, which is pulling the fuel rail and fuel injectors out. It is known to be quite stiff. There we go. Yeah, that was fun. Let's empty out what's left of that fuel. Something to watch out for is that each fuel injector has a silicone O-ring that seals it, and sometimes they don't come out with the fuel injectors, and I've found one here. All the others are still on. Next, we're going to remove this wiring rail, and it's a bit tricky. It just pulls off. If you reach over the top of the valve cover, you can kind of use your wrists for leverage on the top of the valve cover. Last one. There we go. Yep, that's how you do it. All right, so that's free. Carefully pull the heat shield off. This one's probably reusable. We might get another one too, we'll see. If you guys have ever watched my videos, you guys know I hate working on anything dirty, so time to scrape some of the gunk off before we take anything else apart. There's one more bolt in the intake manifold we need to remove. It's all the way on the driver's side underneath the edge, and that holds the fuel rail line. That's a 10mm bolt, by the way. There we are. We can now remove the intake manifold. Well, in order to get to the bolts on the intake manifold, I gotta pull a whole bunch of stuff off, which means I need a dog break. Boy's a good boy. Yeah. Good boy, Lego. Let's go take off all those exhaust components now. In order to have room to access the bolts on the lower side of the intake manifold, as well as the exhaust manifold, I'm going to have to remove the catalytic converter, which for me also means I need to drop my belly up skid plate and remove my middle section of my exhaust in order to have clearance to pull that out. Now we're going to remove the 4 bolts that secure the catalytic converter to the exhaust manifold. Next, I think we're going to remove the front drive shaft where it meets the front differential in order to have better access to the 2 oxygen sensors we need to remove before we can finish dropping the catalytic converter. Now we'll remove the oxygen sensors with an oxygen sensor wrench. Now let's remove the second downstream oxygen sensor. There we go. All right, let's see if we can't wiggle that exhaust out of here. With the catalytic converter out of the way, we now have unfettered access to both the underside of the intake and exhaust manifolds. So now we can much more easily take those bolts out. What you're going to want to remove those is a breaker bar and about 8 or 9 inches of extension, one of which should be a wobbly extension. Makes it a lot easier. Then on the end, you're going to use a 9/16 inch socket. Once you break the bolts loose, they actually come out pretty easily. In fact, yeah, a couple turns with a wrench and they'll be finger loose. There's one. There we go, and there's that one. Already got the very front one out, got that from the top. On top of the intake manifold, there are 4 bolts we need to remove. You can see 3 there, then there's 1 more in the back. There's 2. And lastly, we'll get the 4th one in the back. It's actually the easiest to get out. There's the last one. Now that that's loose, we want to very carefully remove it without overstretching any of these wires or damaging the edge of it. Want to be able to make a good seal next time. There we go. There's the intake manifold. Before we remove the last 3 bolts securing the exhaust manifold, we need to remove the 2 upstream oxygen sensors. Now let's do the last 3 bolts securing the exhaust manifold. Alright, there's the front one. Then we'll do the back one, and then we'll remove that middle one that I'm using to hold the exhaust manifold in place. There's the back one. You can see it is definitely easier to access that one from underneath. There's the front one and the back one. There we go. Both manifolds are off. If you look inside the head now, you can actually see the valves. Pretty cool. We're making great progress now. There's 1. And 2. Remember, the top one is longer. Now let's remove the manifold gasket. Well, good morning everybody. It is another day to work on the Jeep. I have nothing at all planned today except working on the Jeep and cutting the grass, so we should be able to get a lot done. Today I think we're going to start off with removing the fan and the grille. Since the serpentine belt is off, we're going to need to use a pulley holding tool. We'll slip that behind the pulley in order to provide tension right there on the pulley. And then we're going to insert a crescent wrench onto the large nut that secures the fan and the fan clutch. And then while most people will tell you to hit the end of the wrench with a hammer, you can usually just pull them apart. Make sure you provide lots of tension on that pulley. There you go. And now that the nut is loose, we'll remove the fan and the clutch. And it's really important that we store it vertically. The reason for that is there's a viscous coupling in the clutch, which is what operates the fan when it gets hot. And you don't want that viscous fluid to leak into the bearings and destroy the assembly. So always store the fan and its clutch assembly vertically, never horizontally. Also be careful not to damage your condenser when you pull this off, because those fan blades are sharp and the fins of the condenser are pretty fragile. There we go. Now let's remove the whole grill and air conditioning condenser as an assembly. We'll start off with a 13mm deep well socket to remove the 2 nuts securing the coupling fitting here. And we'll just pull to separate those. Next, we need to remove each headlight assembly. First, remove the bezel by removing the 3 T15 torque screws that secure it. Then we'll remove the trim ring that surrounds the bulb itself and actually holds it in place. Sometimes you kind of have to wiggle these out a little bit. Don't force it. There you go. The trim ring is secured with 4 T15 screws. To remove the bulb, just wiggle the wiring harness off the back. Just has a little 3-pronged plug. Pull that out. It's tempting to label each bezel left and right, but they're actually already labeled for you. Using a 5/16 inch box wrench, let's remove the 3 nuts that secure the studs of the headlamp leveling assembly. Now disconnect the 2 ground wires, one on each side. Just a 10mm socket. Moving to the front of the grille, there will be 1 or possibly 2 ambient air temperature sensors. If you have 2, that's because one goes to the powertrain control module and the other goes to your rear view mirror if you have the option where it shows the air temperature and the cardinal direction that you're traveling. Remove both of those using a 10mm box wrench. Looking down through the driver's side headlamp opening, you can see this small fastener that attaches the little wiring harness to the base of the grille. So you want to remove that with a screwdriver or a trim removal tool. If you're having trouble getting that fastener out for that little wiring harness to the temperature sensor, you can actually get underneath it and use a block of wood or a dowel and push it through. Once you get the wiring loom fastener loose, just fish that wiring harness back through the back side of the grille. Just pull it through. Underneath the grille, kind of behind the license plate bracket, or in my case just the license plate, is a 5/8 inch bolt that secures the bottom of the grille to the frame. Remove that. I think before we remove the 6 bolts securing the grille to either fender, we're going to remove the grille braces first. And those are just 2 1/2 inch bolts on each side. I ruined my block key cord a long time ago, so I think I'll just cut that zip tie right off. Those nuts are actually tack welded to the front of the grille, so we need to remove those 6 bolts from the back side using a 1/2 inch socket through the wheel well. I'm going to take the top one out last. That way it'll keep the grille upright and so it doesn't fall over. So there's 3 bolts behind the edge of the grille, and on the side of the edge of the grille are the 3 bolts here, right behind the front fog lamp location. There's the last bolt. And that grille, I think, just pulls right up now. Looks like there's a piece of rubber tape that seals the bottom of the condenser and radiator, so I need to pop that off real quick. Get to one on the other side. There we go. Now we have access to the entire front of the motor, so that after we pull the valve cover and the valves and the head, we can also pull the timing mechanism and replace everything there, as well as the camshaft. Before we can pull the valve cover, there's one nut we need to take off of this stud here, and that holds the wiring harness and its plastic housing in place. That's a 7/16 inch nut. It's not real tight. Now let's get that harness as much out of the way as we can. I zip tied that wiring harness up out of the way so we can get the valve cover off. But before we do that, there's one last thing I need to move. I need to pull this bracket off of where it bolts to the head and unbolt these two air conditioning lines here, and then I can flex these out of the way, and that should give us plenty of room to work. This bolt right here is a 5/16 inch bolt. The larger nut on the bottom is an 11/16 inch nut. These two air conditioning lines just have one single 1/2 inch nut on each of them. Let's just pull right off. So that we don't get anything down those lines, I'm going to cover these air conditioning lines with tape. There we go. All right, we now have plenty of room to remove the valve cover and then the head. To remove the valve cover, it's as simple as cracking loose and then removing the 15 bolts that secure its perimeter. Start up here and just work my way around. Break them loose and then take them out. When you get to the rear driver's side nut, it's actually a stud. On the 1, 2, 3, 4th stud back, a little piece of plastic, not sure what it's for, but we'll make sure it goes back to the same place. On the passenger side, the 4th nut back has a stud, and the 5th, 6th, 7th nut back, the one in the very right rear corner, is also a stud. Last one. There we go. So we don't hook the edge of the valve cover. When we take it off, I think I'm going to pull off this ground nut as well off of this back head stud. This is an 11/16 inch nut. Well, it's the moment of truth. See how the valvetrain looks. Well, I am very happy with how everything looks. Since I'm the original owner and they're that clean, that means I've done a good job. In order to pull off the timing chain cover, we're going to need to remove the pulley from the water pump. So we'll use a pulley holder and a 1/2 inch socket. Remove the idler pulley for the serpentine belt. Next, we'll disassemble all the valvetrain components. The push rods, the rocker arms, the bridges, and the valve springs. We'll start by removing the bolts that secure the bridges. And the trick to this is you only want to turn these bolts about 1/4 turn at a time. So I would use a longer breaker bar so you have good control. These bolts are removed with a 1/2 inch socket. Turning them 1/4 turn at a time helps prevent bending the bridges. I'm not going to reuse these, but if you are, this is very important. Plus, maybe I'll have some bad parts and need to reuse them, so definitely do it the right way. Special thanks to Jeep Solid for the idea of using an egg carton to organize your rockers. Before loosening the bolts to each rocker arm, it's not a bad idea to give each one a little shake and listen. There should be no movement, it should be solid. This one, listen carefully. That indicates that there's a problem with my valve lash underneath. Now we'll remove the push rods one at a time, being sure to keep them in order. In order to have better access to the two rearmost valve springs and keeper assembly, I think it's going to be easier if we just go ahead and take the head off now and do this out in the garage floor. So in order to do that, we need to remove the valve cover gasket because part of it actually covers some of the bolts that we need to remove right here and right here. Let's go ahead and actually remove what's left of the thermostat gasket and pull the thermostat off real quick. Since we're there, we'll definitely replace it when we reinstall the head. I was double checking around the head to make sure there's nothing else I needed to remove before I pull it, and there's one little bolt here that has an attachment for a sensor as well, so let's remove that. This is removed using a 7/16 inch box wrench. Kind of hard to get to. There we go. Some things are just easier with your fingers. Now we should be able to remove the nut that's behind it, which looks to be a 1/2 inch. Yep. Pull the plastic fastener off the stud, remove that 7/16 inch nut, and then we're going to need to use a deep well 1/2 inch socket in order to remove this. Oops. Finally, let's remove this coolant line that attaches using 3/4 inch flats onto the top of the water pump. If you don't remove this, it'll block being able to pull the head straight up off the block. I suppose now is as good a time as any to use a 5/8 inch spark plug wrench and pull plugs. I'd say those all look just how they should. Even gaps, no carbon, no oil fouling. Nothing remarkable, that's just what we want to see. There are 14 head bolts we will need to remove, 7 on each side. When tightening the head bolts on a Jeep 4-liter, you work in a spiral and you work your way out. So in order to loosen the head bolts, we're going to do the exact opposite. We're going to start at the back and spiral our way in. We'll crack each bolt loose, and then in 2 or 3 stages we'll remove each one. In order to remove the head bolts, you're going to need to use a breaker bar with a 1/2 inch deep well 12-point socket. And they are tight. So we're going to try and get about a 1/4 turn, give or take, on the first round when we crack them loose. That's bolt 14. Now we'll do bolt 13. follow your spiral around to the front, bolt 12. Make sure it's on all the way. Come around to here. Installing and removing the head bolts in this pattern prevents the head from warping or deforming under pressure. It's helpful to have a little drawing or a schematic of the order you should do this in next to you as you do it, so you don't forget. Now the middle. Now round 2, and after this round we'll just go ahead and take them all out. Don't need that cheater bar anymore. Now go ahead and remove all the bolts any order you like. If you're going to reuse your head bolts, which you can do one time, make sure you keep them in order. Now we come around to the front. This is bolt number 11, and it's going to have more resistance because when we install it, we need to put thread sealant on it because it goes through a water passage. Then back to bolt 10. Continue the spiral pattern, bolt 9. Let's go put those two in our marked box. Time for the last bolts, bolt 2 and bolt number 1. Two guys can pretty easily lift the head off of a Jeep 4-liter, as can one very big guy. But seeing as I am neither two guys nor a very big guy, I'm going to use an engine hoist. Looks like I don't have room to slide the engine hoist along the side of the car without pulling the tire off. So let's put that side of the axle on jack stands. To lift the front of the head, I'm going to use an exhaust manifold bolt and this threaded portion right here on the front passenger side of the head. Then on the back side, I'm going to use the stud from the exhaust manifold and a nut that used to attach to that stud. Alright, those are both attached. Just carefully lift. There's lots of coolant. Try to keep it away from here. There we go. Head is free. Alright, let's get rid of the old head gasket material first. Now let's flip this over and see if we can't clean some of the oil out of the top section. After the WD-40, I'm going to use some brake parts cleaner. Alright, let's flip this around and clean off the combustion chamber side. Then let's go get some fresh air. Don't want to breathe that stuff in. I'd say that's pretty clean. Let's go ahead and flip that over and start disassembly. Next, I'm going to use a socket placed over the top of the retainer to see if I can knock the retainer loose from the keeper. You can feel each spring compress. That one came right out. You can see one of the keepers came out from the retainer. Now we'll use this valve spring tool I picked up from my favorite online store. That should compress the spring enough that we can use a magnet to remove the keeper. With the head on its side, you can see a little bit better how this valve spring remover works. You can see how the jaws are offset. Make sure that they're fully engaged on the spring. Make sure that it's straight. And then you simply twist the handle to compress the retainer, which takes the tension off of the keeper and allows you to remove it. Now, as you do this, a lot of times the valve itself is going to have a tendency to fall into the head if you're vertical, but since we're horizontal, that won't happen. See how it's starting to loosen up there? There's the keeper, it's two halves. It has three ridges that mate to the grooves in the top of the valve stem and apply tension to it. There's one. Really don't want to go sticking your finger in there, so we use a magnet. A little more. There we go. this valve spring and the retainer. I oiled the tool. That helps substantially. Otherwise it has quite a bit of resistance when you're turning that handle. There's one. Let's get the other keeper. Two. Valve spring and retainer. And the valve. Carefully pull it straight through. Last one. Doesn't take long. With practice you can do each one in about a minute. Retainer and valve spring. All done. Remove that valve. The last thing we need to remove from the head before disassembly is complete are the valve stem seals. And they'll just pull off pretty easily.
Hey guys, you're going to have to pardon my stuffy nose and kind of weird voice today. I've got a bit of a cold, but we can still work on the Jeep. So, with the head all cleaned up, which I now have off to a machine shop for a proper cleaning, it's time to turn our attention back to the block. Something we probably should have done earlier, but we'll certainly do now, is to have removed the coolant drain plug from the engine block. That'll get the rest of the coolant out. Had we have done that earlier, before we pulled the head off, we wouldn't have contaminated some of the oil galleys with coolant. So we're going to have to clean those out before we reinstall the head. Now, pulling this guy out is a bit tricky because it takes an unusual tool. It's a 5/16 inch square driver. Fits in there just like that. Looking straight down into the block, along the passenger side, you can see the lifters all along the side of the cylinders. Let's pull those out first. That is a lifter. You can see where it contacts the camshaft underneath. That one looks pretty good. Alright, lifters are all out. Now that the lifters are out, let's put the engine at top dead center. We do that by rotating the crank pulley with a 3/4 inch socket on a breaker bar. Rotate it clockwise until the timing marks line up. That's top dead center. Top dead center also means that the number 1 piston is all the way up, almost level with the top of the block. Using a screwdriver to hold the crankshaft pulley in place and a 3/4 inch socket on a breaker bar, let's remove the crankshaft pulley bolt. There we go. Don't forget to remove the washer. In order to remove the harmonic balancer itself, you're going to need a harmonic balancer puller. So you can usually buy or even just borrow one from a local auto parts store. Make sure they're all in about the same distance so you get even pressure. And it's off. You can see that my front crank seal has just started to leak sometime this last year, but we'll replace that when we take the cover off. The timing cover is removed with 9 bolts on the timing cover itself and 4 bolts on the front lower lip of the oil pan. You can take the bolts out in any order you like. I'm just going to go around the outside, do the small ones first, which are 3/8 inch. And they're not in there very tight. We only use an inch-pound torque wrench when we're finished to reinstall it. So they should come off easily. Then I'll do the larger ones, which are, I believe, 5/8 of an inch, when I'm done with these. The 4 lower bolts that attach the timing cover are in fact metric. Those are 11mm bolts. And those are actually bolts that secure the oil pan. Now just gently pry the timing cover off. There's our timing chain and gears. What a timing chain does is it keeps the crankshaft and the camshaft in correct time relative to each other, meaning as the crankshaft turns, which moves your rods and your pistons, it keeps those happening at the same time relative to when the valves open via the camshaft and let air in and out of each cylinder. As you can see, I've got a fair bit of play in my timing chain. And despite regular oil changers and clean internals, 17 years of wear just means that my timing is probably off just a little bit because of that play. Because of that, I'm probably losing horsepower that I had originally. Even though it's not hurting anything, there's power to be had just by changing my timing chain. When you remove the timing chain cover, careful that you don't lose your timing chain guide. I'll be replacing mine, but in case you're not, you're going to need that. Before we can remove the 2 timing gears and the timing chain, we need to make sure that the 2 timing marks on the 2 timing gears are exactly aligned on the axis between the camshaft and the crankshaft. We do that by slightly reinstalling the harmonic balancer and rotating it clockwise until the 2 little dashes are lined up. Using a screwdriver to hold the cam gear in place and a 5/8 inch ratchet and breaker bar, I'm going to remove the bolt holding the cam gear in place. Now we should be able to remove both gears and timing chain. That's our crankshaft, and that's our camshaft. This is called the thrust plate, and it provides pressure on the camshaft so that it doesn't move during engine operation. In order to remove the thrust plate, you're going to need to use a Torx size 40. The very last thing we need to do before actually removing the camshaft from the block is you need to remove the oil pump drive assembly. So first we're going to pull the cap off. We do that with a Torx T20. It's important that your engine be at top dead center when you do this, but it should already be at top dead center. because we put it there before we removed the timing gears. It's difficult to see, but there's a 1/2 inch retaining bolt on the bottom of this. There's just enough room to sneak a wrench in there. So remove that. And just lift it straight out. In order to have a bit more leverage and control of the camshaft while we remove it, I'm going to thread in a bolt that's the same pitch as the factory bolt. That gives us basically a longer handle. Let's remove the camshaft. Very gently. Don't want to scratch any of the bearings. Take your time. Do it by feel. Don't use a lot of force. It'll come out. There's the gear for the oil pump drive assembly. Camshaft. There we go.